Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Grow My Salon Business podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Whitaker, and as always, it's great to have you here with us today. And whether you're watching us on YouTube or listening as you walk the dog or driving the car or running on the treadmill or whatever you're doing, I just want to start off by saying thank you for being a listener. Our podcast is growing and we need your help to continue growing because we want to get to as many people as possible. So if you're on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel and share it with your friends. And if you're listening on your favorite podcast app, then give us a 5-star review and a follow. And that would be very kind of you and very much appreciated. So with that said, on with today's episode. Our lives are a journey, and like every journey, where you start out and where you end up is what makes life so interesting. Whether we're talking about where you are geographically or where you are in your career or where you are financially, everything on that journey is all part of a story, your story, that evolves from one day to the next. Now, sometimes it evolves through the choices you make, sometimes it's through the people you meet, and sometimes it's just part of your preordained destiny, or perhaps it's the hand of a higher power that's guiding you. Now, my guest on today's podcast is Tracey Woodward, and she has an amazing journey on every level. So in today's podcast, we're going to discuss the importance of looking like you belong, the importance of asking for help, and not being afraid of getting it wrong, and oh, so much more. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Tracey Woodward.
Oh, Anthony, thank you for having me on your show. I feel so honoured to be here. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, no, thank you for putting the time aside to be here, because I know this is going to be a very interesting conversation. I've never sort of gone down the path that we're going to go on while we're talking, but I'm really excited to do that because I've heard you talk about some of these things that we're going to cover before. I'm going to sort of introduce everything by sort of saying that there's a quote, I think it's by Tony Robbins, and it is, "Your past does not equal your future." And I love that quote, and I do love nothing more than a good reinvention story. So when a mutual acquaintance of ours, Debbie Webster from Sassoon, told me that I should have you as a guest on the podcast, I did a bit of research on you, and you do have an incredible story of survival and courage and, personal reinvention. And I know that you're happy to share it. And importantly, I know that you're happy to share the lessons that come with it. So it's not just about shock factor. And I think that that's really, good for our audience. So I'm going to sort of pass it over to you, because I want you to start at the beginning. And by that, I mean the very beginning, because that's where your story of survival and reinvention starts. And I will just sort of jump in when and as I feel the need to.
Okay, no pressure then. So I suppose the beginning. I was conceived. My mum and dad. My dad was 21 and my mum was 18. It was the first time she ever had sex. She in a caravan on the Sussex coast, and she discovered she was pregnant at 20 weeks. She was always very slim, very beautiful, and I don't know how she didn't discover it, but she didn't. And then at 26 weeks, she gave birth to me by cesarean section. They actually perform a cesarean section because my mum was hemorrhaging. So, I don't know what went on there, but of course, when you don't know you're pregnant, she was doing recreational drugs, she was partying. This was the 60s after all, this is 1966. So I was born at 26 weeks, weighing £1 13 ounces in 1966. Wow. And put in an incubator for 6 months. And the whole family were told, including, my dad, who I didn't actually meet until I was 47. But my dad was told that and my mum, that I probably wouldn't survive, so not to get too attached. And so I think the person that came to see me the most frequently was my grandma. But my mum just went quite quickly back to her life. Discovering you're pregnant you're 18. You're pregnant at 20 weeks, you have a baby at 26 weeks. I mean, I'm sure you just want to run away from that. And and they thought that I would have brain damage or other disorders, and I didn't. But I always think that my strength and my resilience probably started then from my fight to survive. So that's where it all
So
began.
really deeply ingrained, literally in your DNA, that life's a struggle, I'm a fighter, I'm going to survive. So
I think so. I think so. And they say that, and they don't know why yet, but premature babies rarely cry. They rarely, are emotional. They're quite tough. They're quite hardy. They're quite resilient. And I think that the resilience comes from probably just that need to survive, like all humans. Our bodies are conditioned for us to live. It will do whatever it takes to keep us alive. And so I think that that might sound harsh for others, but no one wants to get attached to a baby that might not live.
Well,
so my my dad told me that I was hardly held, hardly touched, because I was so tiny, and then everyone was so scared that I wasn't going to make it.
I've seen a baby that was born at, I think he was 21 weeks, and I have never seen anything like it. Just his hand, I remember this, the baby's mother, it was our next door neighbor, was able to put the baby's entire hand through her wedding ring. Like, it was so small. And anyway, this young boy, he did live, but that is the cutoff point, really, isn't it? 21 weeks, because that's when the lungs are being formed or something.
Yeah. So I spent a lot of time as a sickly child. I've got a huge scar on my ankle where all of the fluids and everything that went into my body, because that was the widest part. And from there, I was quite sickly, and at age almost 4, we were evicted from our family home because sadly my grandma, who looked after me, died of cancer. She had gynecological cancers that metastasized, and my granddad had been having an affair with a woman younger than my mum. So there was no way that we were going to be able to stay in that environment. And so we were evicted from the family home. We stayed with friends. We moved into one room. And that's when everything changed. My life, I think, before then was very secure. I had handmade shoes and a very nice life. My granddad was very senior at Tesco's. I again lived in the family home. My mum used to come and go. And suddenly I was propelled into this environment where I became my mum's friend. We were both trying to survive together. And life was very difficult then in the late 60s, early 70s for women. There was not much support for single mothers. And so she was very, very dependent. And she'd always loved a bad boy. She'd always loved, I'm not saying that my dad was a bad boy, but, it's close. She'd always loved that type of person. And she was very, very beautiful. She was nearly 6 foot tall. She always used to say to me as I was growing up, "Don't worry, you're going to get better looking as you get older." Because she was this gorgeous, glamorous woman that lit up a room. She'd always loved to party. She loved music. She loved dance. She loved alcohol. She did speed. I mean, she just did everything, but she always looked immaculate. And slowly our life progressed into this kind of, bad men, bad male choices, lack of food, criminal activities. And then we just kind of went through different stages. And then she met this guy called Chris, who she fell madly in love with. And I think that they were together for about 2.5 years. And that was probably the most stable my life had ever been. And then they split up, and then, she went straight to a bank robber. So there were guns and drugs and parties, and then from one relationship to another, but had this desire to survive. And I always say to people that I went from, my brother was born at 9, so I have a brother and a sister, and we all have different fathers. So I went from being a childminder at 9 to a shoplifter at the age of 12. So, and my mum would say, "I'm going out for a packet of fags. I'll see you in an hour." And, she'd go out all beautifully done up, and we'd see her like 2 days later. And I'd have to find the means to survive.
Can I just jump in there? For our American audience, a packet of fags means a packet of cigarettes.
Yeah, there you go. Yes. Yeah, so that's what she would say, going out for a packet of fags. Yes, you're right, a packet of cigarettes. And she used to smoke 40 of those a day. So But, you know, she was in all of the London clubs. There was parties at our home continuously. We never had much food, but we always had, you know, stuff. And so it was a very, very strange life and a unique life. But because I never went to school, I mean, I was quite sickly. So when my mum was married to Chris, you know, he paid for a physiotherapist to come in because, you know, I couldn't clear my lungs properly because I still had, you know, I had tuberculosis as a child. I'd get chronic pneumonia. And then, you know, I had to kind of recover from that after he left because it was a little bit more, I was more isolated. And I think that what a lot of people forget, it being hard, but from, you know, the 60s to 70s, but in 1976, a woman could open a bank account in the UK without a man's permission. So previously, I believe that they would have to get their father or their husband's permission to open it. And as soon as my mum discovered that, she had false identifications made in every man's name that she'd ever dated, showing that she was married to him. So that was, you know, a marriage certificate, a passport, whatever was required. And she opened bank accounts all over town. Not one town, many towns, districts with all different banks, and basically cleared the bank accounts out. And by that, I mean went out shopping with checks, cashing checks, getting money. So creating more debt for the bank, but obviously giving herself cash. And so she suddenly became independent in that sense that this was how she was going to make a living. You know, she would go into cleaning jobs and take a cleaning supervisor's role because she could walk the talk and then fire everybody, and then her and me and maybe a couple of other friends would clean a whole block, an office block, and she would go into the office, make up the names, put in the wage slip, put in the cash, and then bring all of that back home and we'd unpack them all. You know, she was very I suppose
street smart.
Anything, yeah, she was streetwise, and it was what have I got to do to survive? You know, she didn't have her mum. She couldn't go back to her father. She occasionally saw her sister and never spoke to her brother again because her brother didn't offer any support. So I think, you know, from my mum's perspective, she was let down by men her entire life, and I think that it was very, very, you know, normal. In certain levels of community. It was, you know, if you were higher up, you were perhaps more controlled as a woman, and if you were lower down, you were less regarded. But she was definitely a fighter, and I think that's where I learned, you know, I can relate my whole life to music because I didn't learn to read and write. You know, one of the things that I had is I learned by reading people, you know, by looking at people's body language, by the way they looked at me and by the way they behaved as to whether or not I was actually going to be safe. And I did go through violence, neglect and abuse of many kinds. And, you know, I have to forgive my mum for that because I think that she went through a lot of that herself too, because we were like friends. And so it's, you know, it's not that it's difficult to talk about, but it, you know, because I do talk about it. And you know, for reasons we'll probably go on and discuss at some other point. But I think the fact of the matter is that, you know, you discover so much about yourself when you have to intuitively understand how you want to protect yourself, how you need to protect yourself from difficult situations. And, you know, the conversations I'm pushing forward to 12, 13 now, where, you know, we would go out shoplifting and she would say to me, you know, and my mum would shoplift to order. We're not talking about, you know, a couple of books and you know, a few bottles of wine. I'm talking about fur coats, duvets, beautiful lingerie, cashmere clothing, sweaters,
and
cardigans.
you do this together. Right.
Yeah, there'd be more than us.
Okay.
But the thing is, if my mum used to steal for a group of prostitutes, high class prostitutes, and if they wanted something, and my mum and I could steal it together, then we would go, and you know, either I'd be lookout or I'd sort out the sizes, or you know, and she'd always say, I mean, this is the time when there were, you know, no real cameras, right? There were store detectives. No store detective ever caught my mum, and they were desperate too. You could see them following her, you know, and she'd kind of leave and go somewhere else. But Yeah, if it was a big order and we could do it by ourselves, then we absolutely would. And if not, she would bring in a little crew, and they'd get a lot more stuff. But I've worn £2,000 and £10,000 fur coats and walked out with them on. I still believe today that half the fur coats that are chained up in London was because of my mum in the 70s.
Okay.
Because and she always used to say to me, if we get caught, you go into care, I go to prison, so we can't get caught. We have to look like we
Yeah.
belong. And so, that we have to look like we belong. I think of that every time I walk into a room today where I kind of feel like I'm a bit unstable, or I'm not sure about the audience here. I think I belong. I think like I belong. And so, and I connect to people in that way. So, there have been so many life lessons around doing these things that, it's definitely not academia, but doing them and then reflecting on what they mean to living a more safe life, a more assured life, a more, normal life, if whatever normal is, but definitely a non-criminal life.
Okay. You mentioned that you barely went to school. And
Yeah.
I don't know if you've mentioned it while we've been talking now, but I know that you have said that you were illiterate, that you just couldn't read or write because you never went to school and no one was
Yeah.
teaching you until you were about 14. So tell us about that.
Yeah. So basically, I never went to school because we used to change our names all the time. Because remember,
Okay.
moving from different properties, not having much money, and my mum took on every boyfriend's name that she ever had. So in those days, it was called the ILEA. I'm sure you remember that group that looked after the education
Yeah.
system. Everything was, paper and pen and pencil almost. So I was kind of a lost child in that, because I had loads of different aliases over the years. And I think that's why today I still have the name Tracey Woodward, because that's from my first marriage to my husband, Dave Woodward. And I have never changed it since, because it was the first time that I could have a name that was actually
So
my own.
literally,
And when we
before
did,
that, your name was changing every 5 minutes. Right.
all the time, every few years. So so I was living under all these different pseudo
Yeah.
names, like a runaway. But that's how we lived. And now when I look back and I think, God, how did my mum, manage all of that? Live with that fear and trauma, and just totally, that must have been with her every minute of every single day. Am I going to get caught out? And I suppose that's what haunted me, so that I started to work with charities. But getting back to the illiteracy, so I got a job in a chemist because I wanted to earn some money. I knew that life wasn't for me. I didn't want this criminal life. I didn't want to, have the high days and the low days, the days when, you're eating a roast chicken, and then the next week you're lucky if you've got a boiled egg. I didn't want to live like that. I didn't want to live like that. I didn't want to sacrifice my life or give myself over to that. I didn't want to, have lots of different relationships, which is probably why I've had very few relationships over the years, because, my mum loved sex. She loved dancing. She loved drinking. She loved, living on the edge. She was definitely an adrenaline junkie and a hedonist. And I kind of have never bought into any of those things. I think, I don't know, some people might tell me different. I love music. I certainly love dancing. But so the reading and writing and getting the job in the chemist was an aha moment for me, because I used to unpack the boxes, clean the shelves, talk to the customers. And I'd been very upfront with the team. And it was actually a friend, a young friend, that saw how desperate my life was, whose sister worked in the chemist, that actually got me the job. And cleaning. So I think they almost begged him that they needed this support. So I was talking to everybody. I talked to the old ladies and the old gents that would come in and queue for their prescriptions, and then I suddenly discovered that the girls that were on the counter taking the prescriptions were earning 50p a week more than me, and all I kept thinking about was, I need to buy a washing machine, I need to buy a cooker, I need to get a flat, I'm going to start saving, I'm going to buy secondhand things, I'm going to, and I'm going to leave my mum's home and start my new beginnings. And I just kept thinking every penny mattered. And so I went to the pharmacist and I said, they're earning more money than me and I work really hard. And he said, and I used to go in on Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, so like afternoons, mornings, and then half a day Saturday. And he said, Tracy, you can't read, so you can't repeat the prescription back, you can't confirm the address, you can't do any of those things. But I'm so surprised because you're so great with the customers and talking, and you have so much confidence. And of course, he didn't know. I mean, there's no way he would have hired me if he knew that outside of this, I'm out shoplifting with my mum, right? And the thing is that I would never actually physically steal something in my personal environment. Yet when I went out with my mum, I turned into a different person and just went on autopilot to, because that was what we did to survive. And so he said, get someone to teach you. And so I went over to my, she became my grandma, although she wasn't my official grandma. She was my brother's grandma, Nanny Mary, I used to call her. She worked as a bookkeeper, and I used to go to her on a Saturday afternoon and Sunday. And sometimes I used to go back because I used to take my brother there Friday night and bring him back on Sunday or Monday morning. He too never went to school, but for different reasons. And she taught me how to read. So I went from reading Janet and John books to Jackie Collins and Julie Cooper and watching Dynasty. And I suddenly thought to myself, I'm just going to be like Alexis Colby. And as soon as I learned to read, I kept what I call a cosmic shopping list. Don't ask me where I got that word from, but it was like I bought a Let's diary, and every year I would write all the things that I wanted to achieve. And, first of all, it was like food in the cupboard, my own flat, a washing machine, a fridge, a cooker, because we used to go to the laundrette. So I hated doing all those things. And then as soon as I hit 16, I rang the council, the London Borough of Lambeth, every single day for 2 years until they gave me a flat. And they said, you've got 3 options. You need to take one of these and we never want to see or hear of you again.
Okay. Let me just ask you this question, because you're at that age, very vulnerable age, and you can go one of 2 ways. It is sink or swim time. You can either be like your mum. When I say be like your mum, there's lots of great things about your mum, but you could have either taken I can't even think of the right way to say this. The dark side, or follow the good side, or do you want the red pill or the blue pill? Do you know what I mean? You were at this point in time. What I want to ask you about is, what do you think? Because I know from a little bit of research, and I know you're happy to talk about this, that your brother perhaps went down the other path, and that he's no longer with us, and yet you had the same upbringing, the same mother, the same sort of family situation. Yeah. What is the sort of the trigger, or what was the trigger, or the catalyst, or whatever it is for you, so that your direction in life took a different path to, in this case, your brother's direction in life?
Yeah, I think some of it was the abuse and the violence and observing, because remember I was 9 years older than my brother, so I saw a lot more of what happened. I saw my mum fight, and I at times had to fight back too, and I would do everything I possibly could to protect my mum. So I think that some of her boyfriends were absolutely vile. They would tell me that they would call me horrific names. They would say that I'm going to end up with 10 children by 10 different men, and I'm going to live in a excuse language, but like a shithole. I'm going to live in some horrible place, and I'm not going to amount to anything. And I must have heard that at least 10 times a week. Okay. And I was stuck in that violence. And so I think that I was fueled and refused to accept that was going to be my life. I in some ways, I think maybe being born premature gave me a little bit more, independence in a crazy sort of way. And my brother, equally loved my mum and sought her approval constantly and took a similar path. And I think that, and again, a complete hedonist. I think there is actually, he was on the news for driving across Stansted's runway with his arse out the window and his bum. So, he was he could free run before free run was even a sport. I mean, he could get away from the police. The things that he did was just absolutely
driving across the airport
crazy.
Stansted runway. Right, the
Yeah,
Stansted.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So in the late 80s, early 90s. And I think that, the fact of the matter is that, my mum was like that. Like my mum would say, we've got to jump, and we'll jump. And so, and I think that that's innate. And I think that, biologically, we all have this balance or imbalance, and we can use that energy for whatever we want, right? We can use it for fear. Fear does you no good. Fear stops you from moving forward. We can use it to propel us forward in a positive way. I used fear for many, many years. Like, if I stay here, this is what's going to happen to me. I have to keep moving. And my brother didn't want to move because actually he got a high out of it. It terrified me. So we had a very different view. And as soon as I could get away from that, I just thought, it's going to be easier for me. It's going to be easier for me. I'm going to be free. So I felt safer alone than I did in the environment that I lived in.
So now you're 15, 16, and you've learned to read. You're still working in the chemist shop, unpacking boxes and stuff?
Yeah. So until I was nearly 16, and then my mum had a brilliant friend who is like my second mum. She kind of did all the things that my mum didn't do. And her name's Tracy too. And she's 15 years older than me. So again, my mum always had a lot of young friends. But Tracy was very stable. She was, she came from a loving home. She got me my first proper job in a cash and carry. She took me for my interview for Clinique in her shoes. I wore her shoes, a size 3. I'm a size 6. I wore a borrowed dress, they were slingbacks, by the way, so any woman that's listening. So, but the fact of the matter is that she was always there. She would feed me when I was really hungry growing up with my mum. If there was a fight and I'd ended up getting hurt, I would go to her and sleep the night. So, there was a lot of violence in our home, a lot. Sometimes, my mum, sometimes the boyfriend, but it was always there. There wasn't a day without an outburst. Because the highs and the lows, the natural highs and lows. So, or being told that you're never going to amount to anything. And so I used to stay with her. So she took me for that job. And what I recognized as soon as as soon as my friend helped me get that job, because we lived on the same housing estate together, as soon as she helped me get that job, and then the pharmacist spoke to me, and then Nanny Mary taught me how to read, and then Tracy protected me from like 13 to 16 in as best she could, and got me my first proper role, and took me for my interview at the Westbury Hotel with Clinique. I realised that there were good people out there that wanted to help you. Whereas growing up as a child, I was left by the people, I was kicked out by the people that were supposed to help me and look after me and love me and protect me. And my mum felt that loss too, her entire life. So I think that, that's when I learned the power of what I know today, or in my 20s to be, was a mentor, to ask for help, to seek guidance, to seek support. And I think that, young people today, it's one of the biggest problems. Like, people don't ask for help. They feel that they should know everything. No one knows everything. No one can navigate. If you feel that you have an idea to be someone, or you want to reinvent yourself, it's not a problem. And you can ask for help, because by nature, most people are good. So my advice would be, to any person that feels lost, seek help. Seek, even if it's a smile, even if it's a cup of coffee, even if it's, just chatting to somebody, seek some support, because you cannot do anything in life that is going to help your development totally alone.
Okay. Wow. I need to take a breath for a minute. The job at Clinique, obviously, skincare, cosmetics, beauty, etc. What was it that drew you towards the beauty industry? Was it just by chance that you happened to be working in a chemist and the girls in there all looked pretty and did their makeup and
No,
whatever? So it was deeper than that, yeah?
no,
Okay, so tell us about that.
it was way deeper than that. So Alexis
Right,
Colby,
okay, yeah.
Dynasty,
Yeah.
the music, the
Mm,
vibe, the energy. I thought, I want to be Alexis Colby. Who looks like Alexis Colby? When I'm in the West End, which wasn't really my place to be, like I always felt like I shouldn't be in London doing the things that I'm
mm,
doing. But the women that inspired me were the women on the
mm,
counters with their hair and their makeup, and they smelt good and they looked good. And it was, I was never going to be an air hostess, so that would have been my second
mm,
choice because, I could barely speak proper English, let alone another
mm,
language. And so from that perspective, I just saw these women as, so vibrant and in control of their life and looking beautiful. Remember, I'd seen my mum look beautiful to be able to engage in crime, to be able to seduce people, to be able to, she used it in a very different
mm,
way. And yet the women that I saw, they were using it to talk to people and sell product. And I thought, oh, well, I can do
mm.
that. That's what I can do.
Okay.
And so that's my inspiration. And I just never really looked back. As soon as I got the Clinique job, um, and it was a point of learning for me, because working for Clinique in Debenhams of Croydon, I would talk to these women. I would know where they were going on holiday. I would know whether or not their husband was having an affair. I'd know what car they bought, where they lived, when they were buying new curtains, what events they were having, christenings, weddings, going to the races. And so I befriended them, and they opened up a whole new world to me. I never knew any of
Mm.
this. I was learning from the people that I was, putting makeup on or testing their skincare, and because I was chatty, because I always had that confidence. Remember, you got to look like you
Yeah,
belong,
yeah.
and I was a good
Mm.
listener because I wanted to learn, I wanted to understand. I mean, I was completely, my tone of voice was as common as Mark. I learned how to to not drop my H's. I kind of I there was loads of things that I discovered there
Mm.
about how I
Can you,
would reform myself.
can,
So get rid of the
yeah,
Cockney
I was just going to
accent.
say, can you dip in and out of that? like, uh,
Oh, every now and
no,
then,
I mean,
every
like
now and
now,
then.
could you or not? Not
I reckon.
really. Because that's what I was going to ask you about
Well,
was that,
I reckon I could. Yeah, I reckon I could just turn a bit common quite
right,
easily.
okay,
It's like, yeah, it normally comes out when I'm really
right,
cross.
okay, because,
It's
yeah,
evident.
I was going to say that the people listening to your story and your upbringing, and this is the effect they had on me when I first listened to it, um, but it's not a fit with the person I'm now talking to. Like I'm talking to this very elegant, very sophisticated, very knowledgeable, very charming, very, well spoken, clever,
Yeah,
educated woman. And it's like trying to, how did how did she do that? Like it's one thing being taught to read at 14 or 15, but that really is almost just a sort of a visible symptom of everything that had gone on in your life in terms
mm,
of
mm, mm,
neglect, like
mm,
emotional,
mm,
educational,
mm.
blah, 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 neglect.
Yeah,
But we haven't even started yet talking about your career trajectory from that point. But so I suppose I'm asking the question to you, which I think our listeners are probably asking to themselves, and you've touched on it already, which is, well, what education did you get along the way? Because I know you didn't go to university, you didn't go back to school or whatever. And you're talking about I was inspired and educated by the people that were sat in my chair and, the people I was doing makeup
yeah,
on, the people I was selling to. And just, is that
yeah.
it? You've just got this, you're
That's it.
intelligent, you're
And being
smart, you're
curious.
curious, and you got the education of life. Yeah?
Yeah, yeah. Definitely the school of life. Definitely. I would consume books as soon as I learned how
Mm,
to read. I was reading a book every
yeah.
week. I would consume books. I would follow paths. I would ask questions. I would continue to be curious. I knew that if I wanted to get my clients to open up, I would have to ask them questions and hope that they would be honest with me. I never ever talked about my life. That was kind of hidden
Yeah.
away. But every time I got a role, I mean, I remember taking the role at Travel Retail and asking the HR director, why did you hire me? Because, I live in Southeast London and I'm driving to Heathrow every day. I have a love of beauty. I have a knowledge of beauty. But can I just ask what made you choose me instead of other people? And she said, because you had fire in your belly.
Mm.
You had this drive and this need to succeed that I saw. And that statement that she gave me fueled the next part of my career. It made me say yes to things that I would never have thought I was able to do. I mean, I'm not, I don't know, shame on me maybe. I'm not driven by money. It's not the thing that, I want a nice life. I want to be safe and secure. But I also have always tried to live in the now, right? Because, growing up, the next day could always have been so much worse than the day that I was in. And so I spent a lot of time living like that.
Yeah.
If I got to the end of the day and there was no violence and I'd had something to eat and I managed to sleep, that was a good day.
Wow.
That was a good day. And so I think that very early on, I've kind of, not given my life over to fate because I've worked hard, but I've accepted, there are good days and there are bad days, and you just have to take each day as it comes.
Have you ever read a book? You just made me think of it. I can't get it out of my head, so I have to say it. I think it's called The Knative Connection. Well,
No.
Apparently I've read it, but years ago, 25, 30 years ago. Conation, Connation, means the fire in your belly. And this woman wrote this book probably in the 80s called The Knative Connection.
Yeah.
And it's from memory at the time, I thought it was a really interesting book, because I often look at people and go, and I've already asked you that question about you and your brother, why does one person go one way, the other person go another? I mean, I've got four brothers and two sisters. And we're all very different. And I often wonder about, well, what is it that separates one from the other? And sometimes it is that fire in your belly sort of thing. Do you know what I mean? Because it's the difference that makes the difference in so many ways. But the other thing I want to go back to, because it's such a good line that your mother used to say, if you want to succeed, you've got to look like you belong. And that certainly stood you in good stead along the way. And you knew how to use that. And you haven't really touched on your career trajectory, but I wrote down some of the companies you work for. I mean, obviously, after Clinique, I don't know in what order these come, but, Clean Beauty, Aveda, Urban Retreat, Aromatherapy Associates, Marks and Spencer's, The Refinery, Donna Karan, Estee Lauder. And they're just the ones that, were sort of obvious to me that I could sort of find. Yeah. And when I say you work there, I don't mean you just work there behind the counter. You ended up running these companies in varying degrees. So that's a huge leap of like that sort of trajectory, like, coming back to the education thing and mentors. Yeah. Talk to us a little bit about that journey.
Well, I suppose, I went from Clinique to Estee Lauder, back to Clinique, then to Orders Department Store Group, and then from there to Travel Retail, from Travel Retail to Donna Karan. So Travel Retail, significantly increased the business. In the early 90s, Travel Retail was the biggest beauty retailer. So Terminal 1 would sell more than 20,000 bottles of Chanel No. 5 a week. And there was no one selling that. And I started at Terminal 4 and did such a great job, and just basically took standards, disciplines and procedures from what was happening when I was a department manager into the Travel Retail, and then was promoted to Terminal 1, where I had 10 shops. So then I became very, very visible to the international market. And so I was offered a role as a brand manager at Donna Karan, and spent most of my, day crying initially, because I thought that I would be driving, sales and looking after a team, and actually I was running the company. But prior to that, when I was at the Orders Department Store, I suppose that's where I needed to learn a P&L. And what I discovered at Orders Department Stores through the contract was that I got an extra 1% of my bonus up to 40% of my salary based on every 1% additional growth over gross profit that I delivered.
Right.
So I was off. I was like breaking things down. I was doing a tester night. I was doing all sorts of things that you probably couldn't do today, but I definitely did them then, with that kind of, genius, non-genius way of thinking to drive profit. But it was actually the clerk there that taught me how to read a P&L, from scratch. because we all had each department had their own individual clerk that would help shape the P&L, log the sales, manage the stock process from a GRN, goods received note basis. And that's where I learned it. So every time I took a role, there was someone that would teach me. At Donna Karan, I reported to the vice president in New York, Cynthia Ahern then, who was an amazing leader and visionary, and put me under pressure to deliver success. And at that point, I didn't understand how everything worked. So I reached out to the lady that did our PR, was a lady called Caroline Neville, who I went on to join her board of cosmetic executive women for 9 years. And she looked after Donna Karan, she looked after the Gucci family, she looked after Ralph Lauren. So she kind of had this refinement that I so admired. Daniela Rinaldi was the head of beauty at Harvey Nichols. She had a genius vision. She found the next big brand. Daniela always had her finger on the pulse. And then a lady called Hilary Dart, who was the head of Selfridges buying. So I had two major thought leaders in the beauty industry and one that was strategic in marketing and PR. And they became my mentors. And when I didn't understand something or I needed to navigate something, I would work with them. I mean, I was going backwards and forwards to New York. I'd been upgraded to first class. I mean, I'd never even been on a plane. I'd been on a plane to Ireland. That was it prior to taking that job. Actually, I did. I'd gone on a honeymoon with my husband, but we used to drive to Spain mostly. I'd never experienced this life. Suddenly I had a catalogue of clothes which were showing the runway shows, and it was 70% off and $20,000 a year to wear on clothes, to have this type of quality outfit that I didn't have to nick. But, that I didn't have to steal was like, whoa. And it almost felt like the bar was constantly being raised for me to step up on and step up to. And I just kept doing that. And it was relentless.
Were you pushing yourself? I remember you said at one point, you said something about, fear that something could be taken away was always your motivator. So was it you sort of going for the next big job, or were you being headhunted, or like, how did that work?
Yeah, no, I was being approached. I've never used a headhunter for a role in my entire life. Right. I was being approached by people. And one of the things that I learned quite quickly, hire people that are smarter than you, hire people that know that. And I wasn't intimidated by that because I was never conditioned in the hierarchy process. That didn't apply to me. So at Aveda, I looked for people that were way smarter than me, that were really exceptional at the job, and embraced that. And I loved my time working with George Hammer, who was, a brilliant entrepreneur and became a very, very dear friend. And so, but I always seemed to be with the right brands at the right time, doing the right thing. And I was constantly learning, and I never denied that to myself or to anybody else. I don't have all the answers, but what I do have is the ability to turn over the stones to find the answers. I'm not scared of that. Yeah. And I think that a lot of people won't do that because they don't know what's underneath.
I remember, reading something about you, and you were telling a story. You just touched on it before when you said you were at Terminal 1 in charge of the fragrance or duty free, whatever it was, and you were selling 20,000. Did you just say 20,000 bottles of Chanel No. 5 a week?
Yeah,
that's a lot of Chanel No. 5.
Yeah,
and anyway,
10 shops. Yeah, non-stop.
Okay, and somewhere connected to that, you had said about how you reduced or you increased the profit, or you reduced the shrinkage or whatever, because there was so much product being stolen, and the way you reduced it was by making sure that the sales assistants weren't allowed to take their handbags onto the floor. Have I got that right? Have I made a complete mess of that story?
No, and being watchful of everybody. So basically what I did is I gave everybody Ziploc clear bags where they could bring, their cigarettes, their change, their food pass, their ID, and everything else went into lockers. And that happened for the whole business.
Yeah. So that's a little bit like where your upbringing sort of really served you well, wasn't it? It's you can't get one over me. Anything you've thought of, don't worry, I've already done.
Oh yeah, I mean, I can spot a shoplifter even today.
Really?
From a mile off. When someone's because I know that fear, I know that sense, I know that adrenaline rush that you get from doing that. I mean, I caught loads of shoplifters in the deli that I had with my husband, and even at Urban Retreat at Harrods. the wealthiest people, would still, take products. It's just, and people not so wealthy, of course. And so, it's just how it is. And I think that's the other thing that we don't focus on, is we don't encourage people to be intuitive, to listen, to observe, to be. And when you can't read and write from a very, very, very early age, you spend a lot of time dreaming. You spend a lot of time listening to music. I mean, my son says that I'm the best Shazam. I'm actually better than Shazam at identifying songs. I can get it, first beat in, because I have I've nurtured my senses in that process, because that's all I had.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay. Listen, we're going to need to start wrapping up this episode, but I'd love it if you'd come back and do a part 2, because we've really been talking about your history. We're not really talking about what you're doing now and the person you've turned into. Yeah. I don't want to shortchange what you're doing now, because what you're doing now is amazing, and the direction your career has taken, etc.
I just, all of the time, I've been growing and evolving. I haven't beaten myself up for not knowing stuff. And I think that's the conditioning of the education system. What you don't know, therefore you must be a bit thick, you must be a dunce, you must be stupid. I'm like, I don't know what I don't know. And still today, I don't know what I don't know. And I remain curious. And even when I take my last breath, I'm sure that I will be still wondering what that person's thinking or doing, and I think that it can be a scary place to live, but it can also be a very exciting place. And I think that's what's fueled me, and that's what's given me my energy. At 58, I still don't know what I don't know, and I will continue to live my life like that.
That is a perfect place to start wrapping up this issue, or this episode, I should say. Tracy, whereabouts can people connect with you on Instagram or other social media channels?
Yeah, I mean, so when I learned how to read and write, Anthony, the first thing I did was buy a diary, as you know, and I used to keep everything in a diary. I had diaries everywhere. So, I started burning them all not so long ago. And
that sounds like a cathartic story.
Yeah. Well, also, I kind of think that, you reflect on them. That I'm in the process of writing a book about my life, and hopefully it will be, a TV series of some sort. Wow. But the fact of the matter is that my Instagram is now my diary. I do not post for anybody but myself. Okay. I put my thoughts down, my feelings. I've talked about my cancer journey. I mean, you know me, but you don't know me. Yeah. You know my inner thoughts, but you don't know if I'm in a relationship with somebody. You don't hear me talk a lot about my children, but you do hear me just blur out what I think. Yeah. Tracey L. Woodward is where they'll find me on Insta.
Right. Well, I'll
or LinkedIn.
Or LinkedIn. Right. I'll put those links in the show notes for today's podcast. And you've just touched on a couple of little things there, which are a perfect segue into a follow-up episode about where you are now and the direction that your life and your career has taken you. Because, there's been a lot of life lessons in what you've been speaking about for the last 45 minutes or so. And I think in our industry, I mean, obviously, like any industry, you get people from lots of different backgrounds, but I think that your background, your story, your upbringing, and the person you've turned into is very inspiring for lots of people, regardless of at what stage of the journey they're at. So thank you for sharing all that so openly and so honestly. So if you're listening to this podcast with Tracy and have enjoyed it, do me a favor and share it with people who would also enjoy it. And don't forget to subscribe and leave us a rating and review on the Apple Podcast app. So to wrap up, Tracey Woodward, until next time, thank you for being on this week's episode of the Grow My Salon Business Podcast.
Pleasure, Anthony. Thanks for having me.
Cheers.